I never thought I'd wake up to what looked like an environmental disaster in my own driveway. But there it was, a thick viscous pool of dark motor oil spreading across the concrete like a malevolent creature from a horror movie. The putrid smell hit me immediately, making me step back and cover my nose. This wasn't just a small spill. Someone had deliberately poured what must have been gallons of used motor oil all over my property. "What the hell?" I muttered, staring at the slick mess that was now seeping toward the street. My neighbor Jim was walking his dog and stopped when he saw me standing there in my bathrobe, looking completely bewildered. "Morning, Thomas," he called, then whistled when he saw what I was looking at. "Whoa, that's not good." "You think?" I replied, a bit more sarcastically than intended. "Sorry, Jim. Just woke up to this. Whatever this is." Jim walked closer, carefully keeping his retriever away from the oily mess. "You know," he said in a lower voice, "I was up late last night and saw Karen from the HOA lurking around your place. Had something with her. Couldn't see exactly what, but—" I didn't need him to finish the sentence. Karen. Of course it was Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, who lived 3 houses down and made it her life's mission to micromanage everyone else's lives. I'd had several run-ins with her before, but this was taking things to a whole new level. "You really think she'd do this?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Jim shrugged. "All I know is what I saw, and between you and me, she's had it in for you ever since you opposed her fence color policy last year." I sighed deeply. The infamous fence debate. I had simply suggested that forcing everyone to paint their fences Oak Ridge cream, a color Karen had personally selected, might be excessive. The HOA meeting had gotten heated, and while I'd managed to get enough neighbors on my side to prevent the policy from passing, Karen had never forgiven me. But pouring oil on my driveway? That seemed extreme, even for her. As I surveyed the damage, I noticed the oil was starting to run into the storm drain at the edge of my property. That couldn't be good. I needed to act fast. "Jim, do you know anyone who has experience cleaning up oil spills?" "Not offhand, but I'd call the city if I were you. That stuff hitting the drains is probably illegal." He was right. This wasn't just about my property anymore. This was an environmental hazard. I went inside to make some calls, my mind already turning over the possibilities. If Karen thought she could intimidate me with this childish stunt, she had another thing coming. I wasn't going to just clean this up and move on, not this time. As I reached for my phone, I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror. My expression had changed from shocked to resolute. "She chose the wrong person to mess with," I said to my reflection. Little did I know this oily mess on my driveway was just the beginning of what would become a neighborhood-wide showdown. After spending 2 hours on the phone with the City Public Works Department, an emergency cleanup service, and my insurance company, I was ready to confront Karen. I showered, dressed in a crisp button-down shirt and jeans, and walked the short distance to the small office where the HOA board held their meetings. It was really just a converted garage in the community center, but Karen had decorated it to look like a corporate boardroom, complete with a nameplate on the door reading Oak Ridge Estates HOA Administration. I found her sitting behind a large desk, organizing what appeared to be violation notices. She looked up when I entered, her face instantly transforming from surprise to a practiced, neutral expression. "Thomas," she said coolly, "what can I do for you today? If it's about your unapproved garden gnome, I've already filed the paperwork for a hearing." I hadn't even known my garden gnome was unapproved, but that was beside the point. I closed the door behind me and stood directly in front of her desk. "I think you know why I'm here, Karen," I said, keeping my voice level despite the anger simmering inside me. "Someone poured oil all over my driveway last night. Quite a coincidence that you were seen in the vicinity around that time." Karen's face didn't register even a flicker of guilt. Instead, she let out a small laugh. Are you actually accusing me of vandalizing your property? That's a serious allegation, Thomas. One that requires evidence, I might add. As a matter of fact, I replied, pulling out my phone, I have security camera footage that shows someone matching your description with a car that looks suspiciously like yours, stopping in front of my house at 11:42 p.m. This was a slight bluff. My security camera had caught someone, but the footage was grainy and didn't clearly show a face. The car, however, was definitely the same silver Lexus SUV that Karen drove. For just a moment I saw a flash of worry cross her face before she regained her composure. Many people in this neighborhood drive similar vehicles, Thomas, and even if I did drive by your house, that's hardly proof of anything. I often patrol the neighborhood at night to ensure everyone is in compliance with HOA regulations. At nearly midnight, I raised an eyebrow. Some violations are more visible in the dark, she responded, without missing a beat. Like unapproved exterior lighting. I leaned forward, placing both hands on her desk. Look, Karen, I know it was you, and worse, you've created an environmental hazard. That oil is seeping into storm drains. Do you have any idea how serious that is? The EPA takes that kind of thing very seriously. At the mention of the EPA, Karen's face tightened. I think you should leave now, Thomas, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, and if you continue spreading these baseless accusations, you'll find yourself dealing with more than just oil on your driveway. Was that a threat? It certainly sounded like one. I straightened up and gave her a long look. The cleanup crew is documenting everything. If they find evidence linking this back to you, there will be consequences. As I turned to leave, Karen called after me. By the way, Thomas, the HOA has received complaints about your property becoming an eyesore. If that oil isn't cleaned up in 48 hours, you'll be in violation of Section 8, Paragraph 12 of our covenant. I paused at the door, incredulous. You pour oil on my driveway and then threaten to fine me if I don't clean it up fast enough? Karen merely smiled. I've done no such thing. But rules are rules. As I walked back home, my thoughts swirled like the rainbow patterns in the oil slick on my driveway. I had expected denial, but Karen's cold confidence unnerved me. She clearly thought she was untouchable, that her position in the HOA gave her some kind of immunity. But I had noticed something during our confrontation, a small detail that might just be the key to unraveling her defense. On the edge of her desk had been a receipt from Manny's auto shop, the same shop where my friend Dave worked, and one of the few places in town that still changed oil for customers. I pulled out my phone and called Dave. Hey, it's Thomas. Quick question. Has Karen Winters been by the shop lately, and did she by any chance ask about disposing of used motor oil? Dave's response made me smile for the first time that day. Sometimes the universe delivers justice in unexpected ways. Dave's information was gold. Not only had Karen been to Manny's auto shop the day before, but she had specifically asked what they did with their used motor oil. When Dave told her they paid a disposal company to take it away properly, she'd asked if she could have some for a gardening project. Dave, thinking it odd but not wanting to question a customer, had reluctantly given her a 5-gallon container of used oil, making her sign a waiver stating it was for legitimate purposes. You have a copy of that waiver, right? I asked, trying to keep the excitement out of my voice. Should be in the shop records, Dave replied, but Thomas, what the hell is going on? Why would she want that stuff? I explained the situation and Dave was appalled. That's not just petty, man. That's illegal. Oil in storm drains goes straight to the watershed. We could get our license pulled if we disposed of oil that way. Exactly, I said. And I think it's time Karen learned about consequences. After hanging up, I did some research online about environmental regulations in our state. The more I read, the more concerned I became not just about the oil on my property, but about the potential damage to the local ecosystem. Our storm drains led directly to Willow Creek, a small stream that fed into the city's reservoir. I called a friend of mine, Michael, who happened to be an environmental attorney. After explaining what had happened, he confirmed my suspicions. "This isn't just a neighborly dispute, Thomas. This is a clear violation of state environmental laws," Michael explained. "Intentionally dumping oil into a stormwater system can carry fines up to $50,000, and in cases of deliberate contamination, there can even be criminal charges." "What kind of evidence would we need?" I asked. "The more the better. Your security footage helps establish presence. If your friend at the auto shop has documentation of her taking the oil, that's motive and means. Get samples of the oil from your driveway and, if possible, from the shop to confirm they match. And collect statements from witnesses." I spent the next 2 days methodically building my case. The cleanup crew had collected samples of the oil before removing it, and Dave got me a sample from the same batch they had given Karen. I gathered statements from Jim about seeing Karen near my house that night, and from 2 other neighbors who had witnessed similar harassment from Karen in the past. Meanwhile, Karen wasn't staying idle. Anonymous notices appeared in everyone's mailboxes warning about certain residents attempting to undermine the HOA's authority and spreading false accusations against valued community leaders. The language was unmistakably Karen's. No one else in our neighborhood used phrases like "incumbent upon all stakeholders" or "preserving community aesthetics." I was in my home office compiling all the evidence when my doorbell rang. It was Maria Garcia from 2 streets over. I didn't know her well, but we'd wave to each other at community events. "I got your notice," she said when I opened the door. "My notice?" I was confused. "About forming a group to address HOA overreach? I'm in." I hadn't sent any notice, but I quickly realized what was happening. Someone was organizing resistance against Karen, and they'd used my oil incident as a rallying cry. Maria showed me the papers she'd received. Unlike Karen's formal, jargon-filled memo, this one was direct. "Tired of HOA bullying? Recent environmental vandalism against a neighbor proves how far they'll go. Meeting Tuesday at the Park Pavilion to discuss next steps." "I didn't write this," I told Maria, "but I'm definitely interested. Do you know who did?" "Everyone assumes it was you," she said with a shrug. "But if it wasn't, maybe it was Diane. She's had run-ins with Karen over her solar panels." The mystery organizer turned out to be Robert Chen, a retired environmental science professor who lived at the entrance to our subdivision. He'd seen the cleanup crew at my house and, after asking questions, had decided enough was enough. The Tuesday meeting drew over 30 residents, an unprecedented turnout for anything HOA. Robert had done his homework, bringing copies of our HOA bylaws highlighted to show where Karen and her allies had overstepped their authority. But more importantly, he'd brought a guest, a representative from the State Environmental Protection Department. As people shared their stories of Karen's petty tyranny, I realized this had become much bigger than my oil-slicked driveway. This was about a community reclaiming its voice. At the end of the meeting, we drafted a formal complaint to be filed with both the HOA's governing board, which existed above Karen's self-permitted executive committee, and the state EPD. The evidence of the oil dumping was just one exhibit in a larger case exposing years of mismanagement. As we were leaving, the EPD representative pulled me aside. "We'll be conducting an official investigation based on your evidence. I should warn you, though, these cases can get messy. Your neighbor might not go down without a fight." I nodded, thinking of Karen's cold eyes and thinly veiled threat. "I'm counting on it." I expected Karen to react to our meeting, but I underestimated just how quickly and viciously she would move. The very next morning, I found an official-looking envelope taped to my front door. Inside was a notice of emergency HOA board action, citing me for orchestrating a campaign of defamation and creating division within the community. According to the document, I was being fined $100 per day until I ceased all activities against the association. The document was signed by Karen as executive director, and 2 other board members I knew were her close friends. What caught my attention, though, was that it lacked the signatures of the other 4 board members required for official actions under the bylaws. I immediately scanned the document and emailed it to Michael, who confirmed what I suspected. The action was procedurally invalid and likely constituted harassment. "Document everything," he advised. "This is exactly the kind of overreach that strengthens our case." I wasn't the only one targeted. Robert Chen received a violation notice about his front garden, which had allegedly become overgrown despite being a meticulously maintained native plant landscape. Maria found herself cited for an unauthorized vehicle when her college-age son came home for a weekend visit. Every person who had spoken up at the meeting received some form of official harassment within 48 hours. Karen was sending a clear message: "Challenge me, and I will make your life difficult." But her most desperate move came later that week. I was working from home when I noticed unusual activity outside. A white van with no markings had pulled up near the storm drain by my property, and two men in work clothes were doing something there. Curious and suspicious, I walked outside. "Excuse me," I called, "can I help you?" One of the men straightened up. "County maintenance," he said gruffly, though he wore no uniform and his van bore no county insignia. "Just routine cleaning." "May I see some identification?" I asked, already pulling out my phone to record the interaction. Both men glanced at each other nervously. "Look, we're just doing what we were paid to do," the second man said. "Lady said there was an oil spill here that needed to be cleaned up before inspection." "What lady?" "Oh, lady said it needed to be handled quietly." The pieces clicked into place immediately. Karen had hired these men to remove evidence of the oil from the storm drain before the EPD could inspect it. I called the actual county public works department, who confirmed they had no scheduled maintenance in our area. By the time a police officer arrived to take a report, the men had packed up and left, but not before I'd photographed their license plate and recorded our conversation. That evening, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number: "Meeting at Robert's house, 8 p.m. Important." When I arrived, I found Robert, Maria, and about a dozen other neighbors gathered in Robert's living room. Among them was a man I didn't recognize, who Robert introduced as Greg Winston, a senior board member who lived on the other side of the neighborhood. "I've been monitoring the situation," Greggy explained, "and what happened today crosses a line. Tampering with evidence in an environmental investigation is a serious offense. As of this evening, I've contacted the other legitimate board members, and we've agreed to hold an emergency session to address Karen's actions." The mood in the room was a mix of anger and determination. For too long, most residents had simply tolerated Karen's regime, paying their dues and avoiding conflict. Now, faced with clear evidence of corruption and potentially criminal behavior, that passive acceptance had transformed into collective action. We formulated a plan. Greg and the other board members would formally suspend Karen and her allies pending investigation. Robert, with his academic credentials, would work with the EPD to ensure proper environmental testing, and I would compile all evidence of Karen's retaliatory actions against residents. As the meeting was wrapping up, my phone rang. It was Michael, and he sounded urgent. "Thomas, you need to check your email right now. Karen's lawyer just sent a cease and desist letter threatening to sue you personally for defamation, trespassing, and, get this, environmental damage." "What? That's absurd." "It gets worse. She's claiming you poured the oil yourself to frame her and generate support for taking over the HOA. And she's filed an emergency injunction to prevent any board meeting from taking place without her approval." The room had gone quiet as everyone listened to my end of the conversation. When I hung up and explained, Maria was the first to speak. "She's desperate," she said firmly. "This is what cornered animals do. They lash out. It means we're winning." Robert nodded gravely. "But desperate people can be dangerous. We need to be prepared for what comes next." None of us could have predicted exactly what next would entail. As we left Robert's house, we found Karen herself standing in the street, taking photographs of all our cars and writing down license plate numbers. "Documenting the conspiracy," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "for the court records." I stepped forward. Karen, this has gone far enough. You dumped oil on my property and into our water system. You've harassed everyone who stood up to you. Just stop now before you make things worse for yourself. She lowered her camera and looked at me with such intense hatred that I actually took a step back. You have no idea who you're dealing with, Thomas. None of you do. By the time I'm finished, you'll wish you'd never moved to Oak Ridge Estates. It wasn't just her words that chilled me. It was the absolute conviction behind them. Karen truly believed she was righteous in this battle, that we were the villains threatening her domain, and that made her unpredictable. As we all headed to our respective homes, I couldn't shake the feeling that our neighborhood dispute had escalated into something much darker. What had started with oil on my driveway was now a full-blown war, and the environmental damage was just the opening salvo. The State Environmental Protection Department responded quickly to our complaint. 2 days after our meeting, inspectors arrived at Oak Ridge Estates with testing equipment and sampling materials. I watched from my porch as they methodically collected evidence from the storm drain near my house. Dr. Patel, the lead inspector, approached me after completing her initial assessment. Mr. Thomas, I can confirm we've found significant petroleum contamination in the drainage system. What concerns us is that the readings get stronger downstream, suggesting this might not be an isolated incident. As we discussed the findings, Karen's silver Lexus slowly drove by, her face clearly visible as she surveyed the scene. Dr. Patel noticed my reaction and asked if that was the HOA representative I suspected. When I confirmed it was Karen, she made a note and mentioned they would be speaking with her as part of their investigation. The inspection team traced the contamination path all the way to Willow Creek, drawing attention from residents who gathered to watch. By late afternoon, a local news crew had arrived, eager for a story about the environmental investigation. When the reporter approached me for comment, I carefully explained finding the oil on my driveway and reporting it to authorities. Before I could say more, Karen appeared beside us, inserting herself into the interview. As the executive director of the Oak Ridge Estates HOA, I assure everyone we take environmental issues very seriously, she said smoothly. We're fully cooperating to identify the perpetrator. In fact, we're offering a reward for information. She was attempting to redirect suspicion, suggesting the incident might be related to disagreements about HOA governance rather than her own actions. Fortunately, Dr. Patel intervened and provided the reporter with factual information about the contamination. We're dealing with approximately 5-10 gallons of used motor oil that has entered the stormwater system and reached Willow Creek, which feeds into the Marshall Reservoir, Dr. Patel explained. Our immediate concern is wildlife impact and potential contamination of the water supply. When asked if charges would be filed, Dr. Patel confirmed that willful contamination of a waterway carried significant penalties under state law. At this, Karen's composure briefly slipped before she quickly recovered. That evening, the story led the local news, with the most powerful image being a small duck struggling to clean its oil-coated feathers on the bank of Willow Creek. This visual transformed our neighborhood dispute into an environmental crisis that even Karen's most loyal supporters couldn't ignore. Greg Winston, the senior HOA board member, called to inform me he'd scheduled an emergency board meeting and had officially suspended Karen's authority through a process outlined in the bylaws. 5 of the 7 board members had signed the letter. The next morning, despite the rain, nearly half the neighborhood turned out for the emergency meeting. Greg had just begun explaining the board's decision when Karen burst in, declaring the meeting illegal without her approval. Actually, Karen, Article 4, Section 3 specifically allows for emergency meetings in cases of community crisis, Greg responded calmly. Karen proclaimed her innocence until Dave stood up from the back of the room with evidence in hand. Then why did you take 5 gallons of used oil from Manny's auto shop? I have the waiver you signed right here, dated the day before the oil appeared on Thomas's driveway. The room erupted in murmurs as Karen struggled to explain. When Dr. Patel pressed her on what legitimate purpose she could have for used motor oil in a residential setting, Karen's defense collapsed. Rather than admit defeat, she lashed out, blaming me for turning the community toxic before storming out with a final threat. "This isn't over, Thomas." Greg quickly brought the meeting back to order and invited Dr. Patel to share her full environmental assessment findings that would elevate our neighborhood dispute into something much more serious than any of us had anticipated. Dr. Patel's environmental assessment painted a grim picture. The oil from my driveway had indeed reached Willow Creek, but that wasn't the only concern. Further testing revealed traces of similar contamination going back months, suggesting that Karen's attack on my property wasn't an isolated incident. She had likely been disposing of waste oil in various locations throughout the neighborhood for some time. Based on our findings, Dr. Patel concluded, the state EPD will be filing formal charges against the responsible party or parties. This level of intentional contamination warrants significant penalties. As the meeting dispersed, Michael pulled me aside. "This changes the game, Thomas. We're no longer talking about a simple property dispute or even HOA overreach. This is now a serious environmental case with potential criminal implications." "What does that mean for our neighborhood?" I asked. "It means you have decisions to make. The state will pursue their own case regardless, but as the directly affected property owner and a resident of this community, you have standing to file a civil lawsuit as well. And from what I'm hearing, many of your neighbors would join as co-plaintiffs. A class action lawsuit against Karen and potentially the HOA itself." The idea was both appealing and intimidating. I needed time to think. That decision was accelerated the next morning when I found an envelope in my mailbox containing a formal letter from Karen's attorney. It was a countersuit, claiming that I had engineered the entire situation to defame her and take control of the HOA. The letter demanded $250,000 in damages for emotional distress, damage to reputation, and lost income. It was so absurd I almost laughed until I saw the final paragraph. Additionally, my client will be filing a report with local law enforcement suggesting that you, Thomas, are the actual perpetrator of the environmental contamination, having orchestrated this scenario to frame Miss Winters. She was trying to flip the entire narrative. I immediately called Michael, who sighed heavily when I read him the letter. Classic slapsuit. Strategic lawsuit against public participation. It's designed to intimidate you into backing down. The good news is that our state has strong anti-slap laws. The bad news is that fighting it will still require time and legal resources. So what do? We counterpunch, file our lawsuit immediately with as many neighbors as co-plaintiffs as possible. Get depositions from Dave about the oil, from Jim about seeing her that night, from anyone who's experienced her harassment, and most importantly, we get the environmental evidence from Dr. Patel. Over the next week, our neighborhood transformed into a hub of legal activity. Michael set up temporary office hours in the community center, taking statements from residents. Greg and the remaining HOA board members provided records of Karen's previous actions and violations of HOA bylaws. Dave produced the signed waiver and shop records showing Karen's oil transaction. The most damning evidence came unexpectedly from one of Karen's few allies on the HOA board. Jessica Lawson, who had initially stood by Karen, approached me after witnessing Karen's behavior at the emergency meeting. "I can't be part of this anymore," she confessed. "Karen told me about dumping the oil on your driveway. She thought it was funny. She said you deserved it for challenging her authority and that no one would ever be able to prove it was her." Jessica agreed to provide a sworn statement, which Michael assured me would be devastating to Karen's defense. As our case solidified, we began to understand the full scope of Karen's actions. Beyond the oil dumping, she had selectively enforced HOA rules against people she disliked while ignoring violations by her allies, used HOA funds to pay for personal expenses, disguising them as community improvements, intimidated residents who questioned her authority with excessive fines and threats, ignored environmental regulations in multiple instances, not just the oil incident. The evidence was overwhelming. Karen wasn't just a petty tyrant. She was a person who believed rules simply didn't apply to her. Our lawsuit was filed on a Tuesday morning, a class action with 28 named plaintiffs representing over half the households in Oak Ridge Estates. The local news, already interested in the environmental angle, jumped on the story of a neighborhood united against HOA corruption. Karen's response was both predictable and surprising. She doubled down on her counter-narrative, giving an interview to a sympathetic reporter claiming she was the victim of a coordinated campaign of harassment led by me. She portrayed herself as a dedicated community servant being attacked for maintaining high standards. But she also began quietly trying to liquidate assets, putting her house on the market and transferring ownership of her luxury SUV to her sister. These financial maneuvers suggested she understood the seriousness of her situation, even as she publicly maintained her innocence. Michael flagged them to the court as potential attempts to shield assets from judgment. The case was assigned to Judge Eleanor Martinez, known for her no-nonsense approach and particular interest in environmental law. Our first court date was set for 3 weeks out, remarkably fast for a civil case, likely due to the environmental implication. In the meantime, Oak Ridge Estates existed in a strange limbo. Karen still lived in her house, though she rarely emerged except to leave for appointments with her lawyer. The HOA continued to function under Greg's interim leadership with a noticeably lighter touch regarding enforcement. The remediation team completed their cleanup of Willow Creek, though Dr. Patel warned that some damage to the ecosystem would take months or years to fully heal. There was a sense of cautious optimism among my neighbors. Many expressed relief that Karen's reign was ending, though some worried about the negative publicity affecting our property values. A few longtime residents who had been friendly with Karen before her power trips began expressed sadness at how things had unfolded. She wasn't always like this, Jim's wife Eleanor told me one evening as we watched the cleanup crew pack up their equipment. When they first moved in 10 years ago, she was actually quite friendly. It was after her husband left and she got elected to the HOA that something changed. Power does strange things to people. I nodded, understanding that there was a human story behind Karen's behavior, even if it didn't excuse what she'd done. I never wanted it to come to this, I admitted. All I ever wanted was to be left alone to live my life. Eleanor patted my arm. Sometimes standing up for yourself means standing up for everyone. This neighborhood needed someone to finally say enough. As our court date approached, Karen made one final desperate attempt to avoid consequences. 2 days before we were due in court, Michael called me with news that made my blood boil. Karen's trying to settle, he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. But there's a catch. She's offering to pay for all the environmental cleanup and resign from the HOA, but only if you specifically sign a non-disclosure agreement and publicly state that the allegations against her were a misunderstanding. She wants me to lie? I was incredulous. After everything she's done? Essentially, yes. She wants to save face and avoid the public record of a judgment against her. My guess is she's worried about potential criminal charges from the state. I didn't hesitate. No deal. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about the creek, the wildlife, and every neighbor she's bullied over the years. We're seeing this through. When I shared Karen's settlement offer with the other plaintiffs, the response was unanimous. No one was willing to let her escape accountability so easily. We would have our day in court. The county courthouse stood imposing with its marble columns as our group of plaintiffs gathered on the steps. I felt the weight of responsibility. We weren't just fighting for ourselves, but for principles of community and environmental stewardship. Karen arrived with her attorney, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit. She walked past without making eye contact, her face set in determination. Judge Martinez's courtroom was already packed, with environmental groups and reporters filling the back rows. Dr. Patel sat ready to testify about the environmental impact. Michael's opening statement cut to the heart of the matter. Your Honor, this case is fundamentally about abuse of power. Ms. Winters used her HOA position not to serve her community, but to control it. When Mr. Thomas challenged that control, she retaliated in a way that damaged his property and endangered the local ecosystem. This was not a momentary lapse in judgment, but the culmination of years of increasingly tyrannical behavior. Karen's attorney countered with misdirection and character attacks, portraying Karen as a dedicated volunteer while painting me as a troublemaker. He suggested the oil incident was either an accident or a setup designed to frame Karen. What followed was a methodical dismantling of Karen's credibility. Neighbors testified about her selective enforcement of rules, intimidation tactics, and erratic behavior when challenged. Maria described Karen's threat to place a lien on her house over a fence height half an inch above regulations. Robert detailed how she blocked his eco-friendly landscaping despite it being explicitly permitted in HOA guidelines. Dave's testimony about providing Karen with used motor oil the day before it appeared on my driveway was particularly damaging. But the most devastating testimony came from Jessica, Karen's former ally on the HOA board. She was laughing about it, Jessica testified. I expressed concern that it might be illegal, and she said, and I quote, "Only if someone can prove it was me, and they can't. I was careful." Dr. Patel's scientific evidence confirmed that the oil found in the creek matched the specific composition of the oil from my driveway and from Manny's auto shop. When asked if the contamination could have been accidental, she responded definitively, "No. The pattern and concentration indicates deliberate dumping." When Karen took the stand, she claimed she had obtained the oil for treating wooden garden borders but never used it, supposedly disposing of it properly at the recycling center. Under Michael's cross-examination, her story quickly unraveled. She couldn't produce a receipt for proper disposal and, when confronted with the evidence placing her at the scene, she lashed out, accusing Jessica of lying. "Oil is oil. It's not like it has a unique fingerprint," Karen insisted. "Actually," Michael countered, "the spectroscopic analysis conducted by the EPD does provide something like a fingerprint. Different batches of used motor oil have distinct compositions based on the vehicles they came from." After a brief recess, Karen's attorney shifted strategy, attempting to minimize damage rather than continue denying everything. While my client maintains her innocence, she acknowledges that, as HOA executive director, she bears some responsibility for the incident and is willing to contribute to remediation costs as a gesture of good faith. Judge Martinez took 30 minutes to review the evidence before delivering her verdict. This court finds in favor of the plaintiffs. The preponderance of evidence clearly establishes that Ms. Karen Winters deliberately poured used motor oil onto Mr. Thomas's property with malicious intent, resulting in significant property damage and environmental harm. The judge ordered Karen to pay for complete environmental remediation, $8,500 in property restoration damages to me, and $75,000 in punitive damages to be distributed among all plaintiff households. Furthermore, Karen was permanently barred from serving in any HOA capacity, and the matter was referred to the district attorney for potential criminal charges. As we left the courtroom, neighbors exchanged hugs and handshakes. When reporters asked for my comment, I simply said, "Today wasn't about winning or losing. It was about accountability. No one is above the rules, especially not those entrusted to enforce them." As the crowd dispersed, I noticed Karen leaving alone, her attorney nowhere in sight. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the judgment against her. Our eyes met briefly across the plaza, and I saw no anger, just a hollow emptiness that evoked an unexpected pang of empathy. She turned away quickly and walked to her car. According to Greg, her house was already under contract. The sale rushed through below market value. Whatever Karen's next chapter would be, it wouldn't be written in Oak Ridge Estates. The changes in her neighborhood didn't happen overnight, but they were profound. Karen's house sold within weeks to a young family with 2 children who were delighted to join what they'd heard was a really supportive community. Karen herself reportedly moved to another state, leaving no forwarding address. The HOA underwent a complete restructuring. Greg led the effort to revise the bylaws, implementing term limits for board positions and creating a more transparent decision-making process. Rules were simplified and clarified, with an emphasis on community well-being rather than rigid conformity. Environmental responsibility became a cornerstone of our neighborhood identity. Inspired by the Willow Creek Restoration Project, Robert organized a community environmental committee that coordinated with local conservation groups. We installed rain gardens to filter stormwater runoff, planted native species to support local wildlife, and established a neighborhood composting program. The $75,000 in punitive damages was used to fund these initiatives, with each household deciding to reinvest their share in community improvements rather than keeping it individually, a decision that surprised even Michael. "You don't see that kind of unity very often," he remarked at the ceremony dedicating our new community garden. "Usually once the check arrives, it's every plaintiff for themselves." The garden was built on a previously unused corner of the neighborhood common area, with plots available to any resident who wanted to grow their own food. We named it Willow Garden in honor of the creek that had suffered from Karen's actions, but was now recovering. The EPD monitoring showed steady improvement in water quality, and by the following spring, ducks had returned to nest along its banks. As for me, I found myself in an unexpected role as a community leader, though nothing like Karen's self-permitted dictatorship. People sought my input not because I had authority, but because I demonstrated a willingness to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. I tried to use this influence wisely, advocating for inclusivity and reasonable compromise. When disputes arose, as they inevitably do in any community, I often found myself mediating, helping neighbors find common ground. 6 months after the lawsuit concluded, we held our first Oak Ridge Festival, a neighborhood-wide celebration with food, music, and games. Looking around at the relaxed, happy faces of my neighbors, it was hard to believe that not long ago these same people had lived in fear of violation notices and arbitrary fines. Maria found me sitting on a bench, watching some of the neighborhood kids playing an improvised game of tag around the new playground equipment. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, sitting beside me. I smiled. Just thinking about how much has changed. It's like we're living in a completely different neighborhood. "Same houses, same people mostly," Maria replied, "just a different spirit." She paused, looking out at the festival. "You know, Karen called me about a month ago." This surprised me. "Really? What did she want?" "To apologize, believe it or not. Said she'd been doing some counseling in her new place, coming to terms with how she'd behaved here. She sounded different, humbler." "Do you think it was genuine?" I asked. Maria considered this. "I think so. She didn't ask for anything, didn't try to justify what she'd done, just said she was sorry and that she hoped we were all doing well." I nodded, absorbing this. People could change. I had to believe that, even Karen. "The ironic thing," I said after a moment, "is that in her own twisted way, Karen ended up bringing us all together. Before the oil incident, I barely knew most of our neighbors. Now I can't walk to the mailbox without stopping for 3 conversations." Maria laughed. "True, though I think I preferred the getting-to-know-you method we used with the Johnsons. Sharing a bottle of wine on the patio beats fighting environmental lawsuits any day." As evening fell, someone started a bonfire in the designated fire pit, and people gathered around to roast marshmallows and tell stories. Many of those stories inevitably were about Karen and the oil saga, as it had come to be known, but there was no malice in the telling now. Just the shared experience of a community that had faced a challenge together and emerged stronger. Jim's wife, Eleanor, who had known Karen the longest, raised her glass in an unexpected toast. "To Karen," she said, causing a ripple of surprised murmurs. "Not for what she did, but for what she taught us. That a neighborhood is more than just houses on the same street. It's people who look out for each other, who stand together when things get tough." There was a moment of thoughtful silence, then Greg raised his glass as well. "And to Thomas," he added, "who reminded us that sometimes one person standing up can make all the difference." Everyone turned to look at me, glasses raised. I felt a lump form in my throat, touched by the gesture and slightly embarrassed by the attention. To all of us, I countered, raising my own glass, because that's what community really means. Not one person leading, but everyone contributing in their own way. As we all drank to that sentiment, I looked up at the stars appearing in the darkening sky and felt a deep sense of contentment. The path that had brought us here had been difficult and unexpected, starting with that morning discovery of oil on my driveway, but the destination had been worth it. In the strangest of ways, Karen's act of petty revenge had catalyzed something beautiful. She had tried to isolate me, to make an example of what happened to those who challenged her authority. Instead, she had brought an entire neighborhood together, forging connections that would last for years to come. Sometimes, I reflected, justice works in unexpected ways. Karen had lost her power, her position, and ultimately her place in our community, but in the process, she had inadvertently helped create something far more valuable than the control she had so desperately clung to. A genuine community built on mutual respect, shared responsibility, and the simple understanding that we were all in this together. As the firelight flickered on the faces of my neighbors, now my friends, I couldn't help but think that was a fair trade after all. If you enjoyed this story of neighborhood justice and community triumph, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of everyday people standing up to petty tyrants and turning challenges into opportunities for positive change. Have you ever dealt with a difficult HOA or neighborhood situation? Share your experiences in the comments below.